In our sermon series about Jesus in public life, we're taking a look today at Jesus and foreigners or outsiders. A perfect topic for World Communion Sunday when Christians from all around the world join together at the communion table. Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of each of our hearts be acceptable and pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Who is my neighbor? The question posed to Jesus by the Jewish lawyer, a teacher of the law of Moses. For me, and probably for most of you, the answer to that question would be pretty straightforward. My neighbor across the chain-link fence on the west is Edith, an elderly lady whose yard in the back offers us a spectacular flower garden each spring and summer. And to the south, across that chain-link fence, are Dave and Barb, who share conversation with us and sometimes one of their 5 cats gone astray over the fence. They offer us tomatoes from their garden when ours fail, as most of ours did this year, and we provide cat care when they're off and traveling somewhere. If I were to go a step further with regard to the neighbor question, I might mention the 14 or so folks who live on the streets around our house and who meet 4 times a year at Coney Island Restaurant for our neighborhood breakfast gathering. And on a different note about neighbors, if you were here several weeks ago, you may remember my telling you about my sister Penny, who lived most of her life with severe physical limitations. Penny bought a house in Virginia Beach which came with a very small backyard with high, solid wooden privacy fences on 2 of its 3 sides. She never met the people who lived across that fence directly behind her house, all those years she lived there. And the only contact she had with her next-door neighbors who lived behind the privacy fence on one side of her yard was criticism from them about how Penny's caregivers were handling her garbage cans. I guess the privacy fences did their job. But Jesus' answer to the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor, was quite different from mine. Jesus answered, of course, with a parable, a story that had nothing to do with people living next door to each other and talking or not talking over the fence. His story was about a man who had been robbed and beaten and left for dead along the side of the dangerous Jerusalem-Jericho road, which was known for its steep inclines, its sharp, low-vision curves, and frequent attacks by robbers on unsuspecting travelers. And Jesus' story was about 3 other men, a priest and a Levite, each of whom avoided the wounded man by crossing by on the other side of the road. And then a 3rd man, a Samaritan, who had compassion for the wounded man and who acted on his compassion. And act he certainly did. He delayed his own travel to treat the man's wounds, to lift him somehow aboard his own beast of burden, to take him to an inn. He stayed and cared for the man for the night, and the next day he paid the innkeeper 2 days' wages, asked him to care for the man, and promised to pay when he returned whatever additional cost there might be. After all that, the fact that this man was a Samaritan, a foreigner, might have seemed a relative subtlety in Jesus' story, but that subtlety would not have been lost on the Jewish lawyer who posed the question. You see, at one time, back in their earlier history of Israel, Jews inhabited the area of Samaria, descendants of some of the tribes of Jacob. But these northern tribespeople had been defeated by the Assyrians, and many of them had been taken out of the area captive. Foreigners then had moved in. And by the time of Jesus' day, the people living in Samaria were descendants of the mixed marriages that happened in Samaria. And by their customs and beliefs and worships might have had vestiges of Jewish ways, but they weren't pure, and they were abominable to the Jews. These half-breed Samaritans were considered unclean and treated with disdain by pure-blood Jews. In Jesus' day, Samaritan was a term of derision and hatred. So why did Jesus use a Samaritan, a despised foreigner, as the hero of his story? Let's go back to a time earlier in Jesus' ministry when he read from the prophet Isaiah in the synagogue in his own hometown. At first, Jesus' listeners spoke well of him, but when Jesus went on to remind them of two accounts from their own Hebrew scriptures about God's caring for foreigners, it was a different story. One account he cited told of God's providing food and drink for a Gentile widow of Phoenicia during a severe drought, while people in Israel were starving from famine in their own land. The second story Jesus recounted told of the prophet Elisha healing Naaman, a foreigner, from leprosy, while many in Israel continued to suffer from that disease. In response to those two stories, the Jews in the synagogue were furious. It wasn't at all what they wanted to hear. After all, they were God's chosen people. In their anger, they drove Jesus out of town and even tried to throw him over a cliff, but he got away. What point was Jesus making to his Jewish audience in the synagogue that day by retelling these stories about foreigners, outsiders for whom God had provided care? Perhaps he was calling Israel to remember that she was chosen and blessed by God, but to be a blessing to others of different races who didn't come from within Israel's borders, others whose customs, social status, and even worship might differ from their own. Perhaps Jesus wanted to make the point that God's thoughts about land and customs, borders and blessing didn't necessarily always tally with their thoughts. And in this parable about the Good Samaritan that he told later in his ministry, perhaps Jesus made a Samaritan the hero of his story to remind his Jewish listeners just how much God loves those who have been made outsiders by the insiders. I sometimes sense that in this country, we're in somewhat the same place as the Jews listening to Jesus that day. We live in this country, which by any definition, theological or other, has been blessed in so many ways. But this country, our country, isn't really ours, is it? It's part of God's creation. It belongs to God. Its defined borders aren't necessarily God's borders. So someone who is a foreigner to me isn't necessarily a foreigner in God's eyes. And someone living here whose culture differs dramatically from mine belongs here every bit as much as I do in God's thoughts. And yet in this country, even here in our local communities, we tend to establish borders, fences, so to speak, to our own liking. Fences that will keep us surrounded by what is familiar to us. Sometimes those fences are as simple as distance. We choose to live in an area of town where we'll live near others who are like us, people who will help keep us in our cultural comfort zones. Sometimes we even put up privacy fences or choose to live in gated communities to keep us feeling protected from them, separated from them and their differences from us, and blessed by our comfortable and familiar surroundings. It's kind of what the priest and Levite did in Jesus' parable. We aren't told why, but they apparently weren't comfortable with getting close to the wounded man on the road, so they kept their distance, kept themselves separated, set apart. Their fence was the Jerusalem-Jericho road. They made sure to keep it between themselves and the wounded man, and they walked on by on the other side. But notice that Jesus didn't talk only about people who were foreign or different. Jesus also talked to foreigners and outsiders. He interacted with them face to face. A Roman centurion, you remember a couple of weeks ago we heard about how the Romans would be hated in Israel. A Roman centurion came to Jesus asking him to heal his paralyzed slave. The centurion expressed his confidence that Jesus could just speak the word without even coming to his house and his slave would be healed. Touched by this foreigner's faith, Jesus healed the centurion's slave. And then there was the Samaritan woman at the well. I'm so glad you didn't choose to preach about that last week. On his way to Galilee in the north, Jesus had decided to go through rather than around Samaria. As he rested by a well, a Samaritan woman came to draw water. And violating Jewish and religious custom, Jesus engaged her, asking her for a drink of water. The woman surprised at his request, asked him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Apparently touched by her response, which revealed that she knew full well how Samaritans and women were regarded by Jews, Jesus continued to engage this woman with conversation about living water. And as she continued to ask questions, making clear her desire, her need to understand more deeply what Jesus was saying, Jesus even revealed himself to her as the Messiah she had been expecting. Jesus didn't judge the Samaritans as a group. He met one Samaritan woman and he engaged her face to face. How do we begin to break down these fences we've erected that divide us from them? A good first step, as Jesus shows us, is face-to-face engagement. And we can't do that from behind a privacy fence, from within a gated community, or even from across the road. We must try to look beyond differences, to see beyond the different color of skin, beyond different cultural or religious practices, beyond different languages and abilities. Over the past months, our Habitat for Humanity team has been working to build a house for a family here in this country from Mexico. A husband and wife, and what I'm told are two adorable little 2- and 4-year-old boys. Habitat has a requirement that the prospective recipient of the home devote time working alongside the Habitat team toward its completion. Jo Rocks works regularly with our Habitat team. And in the last few months, she's been coming home from Habitat work days so impressed with the father of this Mexican family. Working elbow to elbow, face to face with him, the Habitat team members have come to know him. He's proven to be so hardworking, responsible, and appreciative. He has shared his deep gratitude for their help in making his dreams for his family come true by providing this house, a home that his family can call their own and where his children can have a safe haven in which to play and sleep, learn and grow. Fences that we have put up begin to break down when we start to interact face to face with difference. I've already told you about privacy fences on 2 sides of my sister Penny's backyard, but on the 3rd side was just a chain link fence. Best of all, chain link fences invite across the fence conversation, engaging, getting to know the people who live on the other side, and responding with compassion when we know they're facing difficulties. Penny had a neighbor on that 3rd side of her backyard too. She was Betty, a black woman who lived there with her grandson. And Penny, of course, was severely physically handicapped. 2 quite different ways of life. 2 women, not foreigners, but 2 women who were certainly potential outsiders in their mostly able-bodied, mostly white neighborhood. They could have made outsiders strangers of each other, too, but they didn't. They met and talked across the fence. And Betty, bless her heart, felt compassion for Penny, for the complications of her physical care demands, and for her loneliness, living there by herself as she did for so many years. And so Betty opened the gate in the chain link fence, so to speak, and came over to visit. Through the years, Betty and her grandson met some of Penny's many physical needs when they could. But best of all, Betty made herself available during Penny's lowest times, when Penny would call her and ask if she could come over just to talk. Not a privacy fence, but a chain link fence it was with a gate that wasn't locked. There is something that goes on inside of every one of us from time to time. For some, it tugs at our heartstrings. For others, it's awakening of neurons and synapses in our minds that causes us to think in new ways. It expresses itself as compassion, becoming aware of and caring deeply about some situation of pain or need in others. The Samaritan in Jesus' parable felt compassion for the wounded man. Jesus was deeply touched by the Roman centurion's faith, and Jesus sensed and cared so much that the Samaritan woman had such a deep need to understand. Jesus' compassion and our compassion is God within us, calling us to respond, to act on that compassion that's been awakened in us. And God's compassion in us is blind to skin color, to customs, to culture, to language, to borders, to physical abilities. It is blind to differences. God's compassion in us, expressed in action, crosses over to the other side of the road of life to where the need lies. God's compassion delays its own priorities for the sake of the other's needs. God's compassion tends the other's wounds with our own hands. God's compassion struggles to lift and help carry the burden. God's compassion pays the bill. God's compassion in us, expressed in action, breaks down the fences, the us versus them thinking and feeling and behaving. That God's precious gift of compassion within us be expressed in action is what God asks of us. Who is my neighbor? My neighbor is anyone who lies in need at life's roadside. My neighbor is anyone, Jew or Greek, slave or free, black or white, Asian, Latino, Middle Easterner, anyone molded in God's divine image. And you know, this neighbor thing works in two directions. When I returned to Penny's house in Virginia Beach after her death, I stopped in next door to meet Betty. I'd heard about her, but I'd never met her. Of course, I wanted to thank her for all the love she had extended to Penny through the years. But Betty really wanted me to know that Penny's gift to her was far greater. Penny filled my grandson and me with light, she told me. Every time we visited, we came away blessed. I have struggled with myself about whether to include this final little story. I'm not proud of it. As I got thinking about what I needed to learn about Jesus and his interactions with foreigners in preparation for today, my own neighbor, who lives in the house across the road, kitty corner from me, came to my mind. He moved in 12 years ago, and I never went over to introduce myself. I know now why that was. He was a foreigner. He appeared to be Middle Eastern, and I had built a privacy fence. Not too long after he moved in, we heard that someone had broken into his house and done great damage, including taking eggs, ketchup, and sauces from his refrigerator and smearing them all over the walls and carpeting and furniture of his home. As bad as I felt about that, I still didn't go over to express my sorrow and support or to offer help with the cleanup. But recently it dawned on me that I needed to follow what is good advice for all of us, that I needed to practice what I preach. And so Joe and I, on a warm afternoon, when we saw him out in the yard, headed over, a loaf of zucchini bread in our hand. In the course of our conversation, we apologized for having waited 12 years to meet him, and he was so gracious in return. He told us that he could have come over our way too, and he was sorry he hadn't. The man had come from Iran 14 years ago. He works here in Battle Creek, and he feels so blessed to be here. We invited him to our upcoming neighborhood breakfast, and he felt quite sure that with all the extra work hours he puts in, he'd be able to get a couple of hours off 4 times a year to join us. We're looking forward to that and to getting to know him better. Just meeting him was such a blessing to us after all that time. We'll never know what kind of blessing awaits us on the other side of the dividing fence until we cross the road or unlock the gate or tear the fence down. And who knows, perhaps someday, when we find ourselves suffering on the side of some dangerous Jericho road, we might just find behind that fence someone who has compassion for us and acts on it and treats us as a neighbor. That is, a neighbor by Jesus' definition. Amen.